Of our Napoleonic weekend here at Old Fort Erie. Here, the British will be trying once again to retake this fort from French occupation. They have had limited success before, but hopefully today's the day. Now, what we're actually reenacting here is a little different than what we normally reenact here at the site on a day-to-day basis. We're normally a War of 1812 site. British, Americans, First Nations allies, and Canadians. But this is a little different. If you can cast your mind back a little over 200 years and a little over 3,000 kilometers to the fields of Spain and Portugal, you're pretty much there. In 1808, France invalidated its alliance with Spain. They'd been allies for years, occupying Portugal and denying their British enemies a very important port at Lisbon. The French could not effectively land troops in Europe to help their allies fight the French. That was a problem until Napoleon decided that keeping Spain as an ally just wasn't good enough, and he began occupying forts and cities in the north of Spain. The Spanish government did not react immediately. They, unfortunately, still wanted to hope that they could keep good relations with France, but when Napoleon arrived later in the year and started to push down towards Madrid, the Spanish army did attempt to resist. Unfortunately, they weren't quite the quality of the German troops that Napoleon was leading down into Spain, and they were caught unawares. And after a few major battles, they were pushed back to their capital at Madrid. The Spanish would take Madrid, or the French, pardon me, would take Madrid that year and send the entire Spanish royal family into exile. In fact, the King of Spain, Ferdinand, gave up all his royal rights to Napoleon in return for an estate and a nice pension from the French government. That did not deter the Spanish people, however, from fighting to return him to the Spanish throne, and the massacre that took place in the square, the main square of Madrid, at the removal of the royal family, was a rallying cry for Spanish guerrillas for years to come, and it would plague the French as they attempted to occupy the country. Now, apart from the guerrillas themselves, the French had a lot of problems in Spain. They'd been having a lot of success over the past 15-some-odd years, fighting all over Europe. At this point, they'd humbled Prussia, half the Kingdom of Prussia, and most of modern-day Germany was now effectively under French control. And in 1807, even the Russian Empire had decided to play a game and join the French continental economic system. That was a major win for them, leaving Britain very much isolated in Europe. But with the opening of Spain, the French army was getting into what would turn into a very bloody morass. When Napoleon left Spain in 1808, pardon me, he had the very mistaken impression that the army in Spain could live off the land. He even said, writing back to Paris, that he'd never seen an army so well fed and so luxuriously taken care of. The reality of the situation, though, was hardly that much. Spain was a rocky and poor country. Most of the peasantry lived on subsistence farming. That meant that there was not a lot of surplus for the four armies that very quickly would be competing for resources in Spain and Portugal, and it meant that with limited supplies and reinforcements coming to the French troops in Spain, they had to rely on pillaging the countryside to feed themselves. This did not endear them to the locals, and it meant that every town they went through would inevitably be hostile if they could afford to do so. It also meant that the French, if they had to go anywhere, transport any amount of supplies, even simple letters from town to town, had to have armed guards posted constantly. It was said that a message could not go from one town to another without at least a platoon of infantry or a troop of cavalry to protect it in the mountain passes, where the Spanish guerrillas liked to lie in wait to ambush their French adversaries. And apart from leading the French into a morass in Spain, Spain's declaration of war also left the British with a great opportunity. Spain had been providing most of the troops the French relied upon to keep Portugal under occupation and keep the Royal Navy out of Lisbon. But when those Spanish troops went home to fight the French invaders, the 20-odd thousand French troops that were still in Portugal now found themselves isolated. They managed to remain in country for another year until 1809, even beating back an initial British force that landed at Corona. But unfortunately for the French, eventually Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, as he would later be known after his victory at Talavera in 1809, landed with fresh troops and was able to isolate the French troops in Portugal and secure their surrender. This was a huge blow which opened up the entirety of Portugal to British and Portuguese occupation, and they would use that country as a base of operations protected behind the mountains along the border for the next 5 years of fighting.
Commander could always tell if he had a rifle taken out on the field, like a pound of gun. There we go again.
Now, as the battle's starting to get underway in particular, I would like to point your attention to some of the staff members we have going around. They'll have buckets that say support the fort. While we don't obviously require anyone to give any money, we do appreciate it. This site does not run on tax dollars for its day-to-day operations, and has not since the parks took the property in 1888. Because of that, we can only host events like this, as well as our daily programming and our educational initiatives, based on the money that comes in from kind visitors like yourselves. So any amount of money you're willing to donate would be greatly appreciated. At this point, we can see the British and French troops starting to form up in line out on the open ground. This was the standard way the European armies and their ilk fought during the early 19th century, known in French as the Ultra Mince. This had been standard since the 1600s, and not a heck of a lot had changed until the 1790s. Most troops were rather rigid. They moved slowly and fired brilliantly. But the French army started to change that. In the 1790s, with the Revolution and the death of the king in 1793, France found itself at war with all of its major neighbors. They needed troops quickly, but the Revolution had lost them most of their trained officers, and a lot of their soldiers had also left for other countries to fight for the Bourbon monarchy. Because of that, they needed to find new ways to fight, new ways to raise troops. And in the first 2 years of these wars, between 1793 and 95, they raised some 400,000 conscripts and volunteers to fill the ranks, ensuring that even though they were surrounded, they often had a numerical advantage. Unfortunately, having that many untrained troops meant that the Ultra Mince, these nice lines you see here, were not often possible. You need training and good leadership. So often what you'd have are professional troops, like the ones you see out here on the field, in lines pouring volleys of trained fire into the enemy, while those conscripts and volunteers were led in massed assault columns, narrow, easy to maneuver, using the bayonet instead of their firepower to charge the enemy line and break through sheer force. This often worked well for the French army, but what it didn't do was negate heavy casualties. And by 1809, when the French were completely invested in the fighting in Spain, you found that their ranks at home were starting to dwindle. More and more, the French army relied on non-French troops from Germany, Italy, and Poland to substitute their ranks. Even the Spanish had been doing this before the invasion, and it also meant that good quality recruits were in short supply for the very desperately needed troops in Spain. Now, one common question we also get now that we see them all out in line in the middle of open ground shooting at one another less than 50 yards away is, why would you do that? Why would you wear these bright, elaborate uniforms out onto the middle of an open field and exchange gunfire? Well, you might be able to notice that even with the relatively small number of guns we have out here compared to the battles at the time, and with the heavy wind carrying it away, there's a lot of smoke coming out of these black powder weapons. That was a major factor. It's one of the main reasons why you had these bright and elaborate elaborate uniforms. If you were marching to the beat of the drum on open ground, your friends and enemies would hear you coming half a mile away, but you wanted to make sure that those friendly units knew exactly who you were before you burst through the smoke 30 yards in front of them. That's why you'd wear what are effectively team colors. Red was often associated with British troops, blue was often associated with the French troops of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period, to try and cut down on tragic incidents of friendly fire. You can see, though, coming out at the front, some non-red or blue-clad troops. Those are riflemen from two regiments, the famous 95th, who saw so much service in Spain, and with the red cuffs and collars, the 60th Royal Americans, an older regiment that had first been raised in the United States, or on the United States, in the 1750s to fight the French, now fighting in Spain against Napoleon. Now, the first few years of fighting between Britain, Portugal, and France in Spain was marked by regular field battles, like the ones you would see here at places like Talavera and Salamanca. The British and the French, in some cases, won major victories against their foe in the field, but the fighting was never conclusive. At the end of the campaigning season, the British were able to pull back to their bases in Portugal and use the mountain passes to keep themselves safe. So neither the French nor the British, until around 1812, were able to gain a decisive advantage, but it did allow the British, who could very quickly and efficiently bring troops and supplies into ports like Lisbon on the Atlantic coast, to outfight the French, who had to bring all of their troops and supplies across miles and miles of hostile Spanish country, with Spanish guerrillas who were fighting directly in concert with those same British troops, which gave them a much harder time. As you're seeing the troops move around, they often have men in fancy uniforms and swords ordering the rest of the men around. Those are the officers. They're often easy to pick out based on what they're wearing and the weapons they'd be carrying. And while the stereotype of officers at the time is the youth aristocrats hanging back and letting the regular troops do the fighting, the truth is it's often the opposite. Junior officers, like you'll be seeing out here, often led from the front because of the problems with black powder smoke, the noise and lack of communication on a battlefield. Junior officers who are most directly responsible for controlling the fighting had to be seen and heard. That means close to the fighting and often at the front of it to lead the troops in by example. Otherwise, orders might not be effectively taken through. Because of that, in many conflicts, junior officers had higher rates of casualty than they were leading, sometimes as much as 2 or 3 times higher at certain battles, which meant that they did not have quite as cushy a lifestyle as you might imagine. You can also see here, while most of the troops are in tightly packed formation, shoulder to shoulder, firing volleys, the 95th and 70th rifles in front of us, although they are firing in volleys, are spaced out, man to man to man. That's for an important reason. They worked as light infantry most of the time. The regular battalion troops you can see en masse out here would have been marching in unison, shoulder to shoulder, to keep cohesion and prevent concentrated fire. The rifles, on the other hand, would often be in these more dispersed formations, which allowed them to better weather those musketry volleys and allow them to harass the enemy quickly, move to and fro, put fire on them, break up their order, and snipe off targets of importance, like the officers and musicians, to sow confusion among the enemy ranks. It also helped that most of these light troops were much better trained and more disciplined than a lot of the regular troops you found on the field. They had to be. They had to have some kind of personal initiative and enough wherewithal to keep themselves in good order, even when not under the direct command of their officers. You can also hear in the background, at the very least, some of the cannons we have on the field here today. Cannonading at the time, or cannons, mortars, and other pieces of artillery, were the most efficient ways to kill people on open ground. Despite the fact that muskets and rifles took up most of the weapons you'd find, in most major battles, it was the cannons that caused a majority of the death and chaos. This was for one very simple reason. You have long tubes filled with gunpowder and large metal cylinders that are meant to fly through the field at quick speed through bodies of men. At a range of 600 yards, a 9-pound cannon could have got a shot through nearly 30 people straight through, and as it digs its way through that line, it shows confusion and can sometimes cause the chest compartments of the people actually being hit to spray forth with shrapnel bone, which makes it even more. As I said, the first few years of fighting in Spain and Portugal were ultimately rather inconclusive. The French were successfully able to eventually push the British back out, and the British and Portuguese made permanent gains, but that did start to change. In 1812, a new campaign was devised for the spring, where the British and their Portuguese allies struck out into Spain to capture a number of border fortresses and fortified towns. This was helped by the fact that the French troops made a redistribution of their troops further south away from some of these fortresses in February, which led the Duke of Wellington to decide that this was the perfect time to attack. Most of the battles they fought were very successful. They lay siege to places like Almeida and Ciudad Rodrigo, which fell quickly as they were ungarrisoned until they prepared for the British onslaught. Men from those garrisons then moved south towards Badajov. Wellington and his main force were encamped. Badajov was the hardest to take and the most important of these fortresses. It guarded a main road into Portugal that would connect British troops marching towards Madrid to their base in Lisbon. Without the control of Badajov, they wouldn't be able to guarantee they wouldn't be cut off and surrounded by the French once they were deeper into the Spanish countryside. You can see here that the French are retreating back within their fortification. British firepower in the open has proven just a little too hot for them, and they've decided to take the safety and security of the walls and their cannons within. As the British approached Badajov, the French did the same thing. They fortified and constructed a number of fortified bastions located outside the walls, connected by trenches and ditches that would allow them forward positions to attack those British siege lines. When the British arrived in mid-March of 1812, they began to do just that. They dug trenches and started setting up gun positions, and it was the infantry that you can see out here that did most of the work. They were the heavy labor whenever the British or French armies needed it. The French, of course, attacked regularly. After just a few days, a massive raid of 1,500 men, about a fifth of the French garrison, sallied forth in the middle of the night and attacked those trenches. The attack was rather short and didn't kill or wound too many on either side, but it did give the French a small victory. They were able to kill the chief engineer of the British Army in Spain.
Oh, yeah.
And you can see here that the British, now that they've controlled the ground around the fort, are wheeling up their artillery to lay siege. This was, of course, a very important part of laying siege, and the British regularly brought up new and heavier guns as their lines moved closer and closer to the walls. Initially, these would have been lighter guns, often 9 and 12-pound guns, but after the British had taken one of the outlying forts, Fort Victorina, on March 25th of 1812, they started bringing in the Their 18 and 24-pound howitzers. These were massive guns, which in some cases had a maximum range of the better part of 2 miles, and could have fired both explosive shells over the walls to kill and wound troops inside, as well as solid iron shot to knock down the walls. The Duke of Wellington's plan here was to knock 3 walls, or 3 holes in the walls and bastions of the east side of the city to use as an entrance when the British would storm it in April. I believe we're about to fire on one of the cannons. There we go. And we can now see our British troops are valiantly assaulting the walls. By the night of the 6th, they'd opened up 3 separate holes in the French defenses, and along with 2 diversionary attacks on the north and south, they decided now was the perfect time to take the fort. Now, historically, this was not immediately successful. The British troops attacked 3 times, but the French had concentrated themselves around those breaches and threw them back. It ultimately turned out that the diversionary attacks on the castle and the southern wall proved more useful. They captured territory and forced the French to fall back inside the city, lest they be flanked. On the 4th assault, British troops found that the way was more or less open to them, but in the course of the battle, they lost over 2,000 men killed. That's almost the total number of men who were wounded during the 6 months of siege here at Old Fort Erie in 1814, lost in only 5 hours of fighting in a single night. An extremely bloody battle. And after the battle, British troops, now desperate and rather tired from the days of fighting, started to loot the town. For 3 whole days, British officers could not control their troops. They looted private homes and businesses, and it wasn't so much stopped, according to one officer, as it petered out, as the troops tired and eventually fell back into the ranks. Wellington, unfortunately, could not punish many of these men. The entire army had been involved, which meant that some were made example of, whereas most of them were simply given a slap on the wrist and told not to do it again. With that, though, the British troops are up and over the walls, and they're trying to take the town inside. The fighting inside of Badajov, as well as any siege where the troops were able to get inside the walls, would have been incredibly bloody. In close quarters, in the streets that they were fighting in, you didn't have the big open fields to maneuver. Instead, things often turned into a meat grinder, with troops trying to force their way through enemy gunfire, often at the point of the bayonet. A nasty weapon, and in fact, the one they used at the time is technically illegal, according to the Geneva Convention today, because of just how much damage it did. All right, it looks like the British have successfully carried the walls and the fort inside. So they finally succeeded. Yeah, round of applause. With that, that should conclude the major part of the fighting here today. Thank you all very much for coming out. But yet again, before we leave, I would like to thank the Brigade Napoleon and Crown Forces North America, who these reenactors come from, for coming out today and volunteering their time. So we give them a nice round of applause as well. Obviously, without them, we wouldn't be able to do events like this.